Thank you, Kristen, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this virtual training on supporting employees with disabilities during COVID-19. My name is Dennis DeYoung, and I am a business relations specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. My primary role is assisting students and adults with disabilities in finding permanent employment with the state of Ohio through our apprenticeship program, as well as advocating for the job seekers we serve with state agencies. I am excited to be here this morning co-presenting with my colleague, Julie. We have some great information and resources to share with you on this very timely and important topic. A good bit of our discussion today will highlight some best practices on how to communicate the new workplace guidelines employers are implementing during the pandemic with employees with disabilities. And then we will talk about some innovative ways to provide job coaching remotely. Today's presentation will be a back and forth conversation between Julie and me. Julie is our worksite accessibility specialist here at OOD. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us how the topic of today's training came to be?
Thank you, Dennis. It is certainly a pleasure to co-present with you this morning. And good morning to all of you who are joining us. We are grateful to have this platform to connect with you during the pandemic, and we have some great information to share today. As Dennis mentioned, I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist, and my primary role is to work directly with our employer partners when they have questions that relate to accessibility. And that can include quite a variety of topics, like navigating Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or discussing the accessibility guidelines for the physical and digital environments. Or often I work with employers to identify the general possibilities for reasonable accommodations in their specific workspaces. The majority of today's content was created from a request we received from an employer. We heard from an employer pretty early into the pandemic that wanted to know the best way to communicate information to employees with disabilities about the policies and procedures they were implementing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was from that request that we compiled resources and examples to support the employer's specific training needs, and we added some additional best practices we felt could be helpful. And then our team realized if one employer has this question, others likely do too. Now that more businesses are bringing employees back to work, we thought providing a general training on this topic could be helpful. And as we all know, the work environment is different now. Employers are implementing guidelines for social distancing, using protective equipment, and disinfecting workplaces. And these guidelines need to be communicated quickly and effectively to all employees, including employees with disabilities. So to make sure that all of your employees are implementing these new procedures safely and correctly, it may be helpful to learn how to make training communications accessible. And through this training, we have put together some best practices to help employers do that.
Julie, I think you bring up two great points. One, this information is being communicated quickly. And second, to communicate these new rules effectively, it is helpful to know some best practices for delivering that information. So today's presentation will begin with an understanding of some general tips, and then we will talk more in depth about best practices for communicating information with deaf and hard of hearing employees, blind and low vision employees, and employees with intellectual disabilities. And then we will conclude today's discussion with some creative ways to provide job coaching remotely. But before we dive in, I want to point out some resources we have available for you. In addition to the PowerPoint slides, you have access to the Learner's Guide, which includes more information than what we will cover during the presentation, and it includes resources used to create the training. We have also created 4 guides for employers. There is a guide for each of the disability groups we are discussing today, as well as a guide for remote job coaching. You can access these resources through the employers page of the OOD website at ood.ohio.gov www.untitled.org/employers. We've also included a link to that page in the question and answer section. Just as a reminder, the information shared in all of these resources and during the discussion this morning is only for educational purposes and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful as you transition successfully back to your new work environment. During today's presentation, please feel comfortable to post questions in the question and answers area at any time. We will be stopping between main topics to answer your questions. And with that, let's begin. As Julie mentioned, in this environment of the COVID-19 pandemic, employers are finding that they need to quickly communicate information to their employees. And it's important that this information is understood so that new procedures are carried out correctly and safely. The first step an employer may want to take is to identify what information needs to be shared and then determine the best way to share it. Before we talk about some communication tips for specific types of disabilities, Julie, what are some good general tips that apply to everyone?
Dennis, you are absolutely correct. It's important to identify what information needs to be shared and then give some thought to the best way to communicate that information. A great starting place is to consider accessibility when you're in the planning phase of creating training. Rather than waiting to make materials accessible after you receive a request for an accommodation, you may want to be proactive and integrate some of these ideas we will discuss today into your training up front. And when you do that, you may discover that the changes you implement benefit all employees. And when that happens, when accessibility works for everyone, that is when we truly start to shift to an environment that is inclusive of everyone. I'll point out those kind of examples as we go through the information this morning. It's important to remember, though, that despite these efforts, communication and training needs vary from employee to employee, and an employee with a disability may need to request an accommodation. So to support this, it's a best practice to make it easy for an employee to ask for help. One of the ways you can do that is by including an accessibility statement that is easy to find on all of your communication materials. And this will do two things. First, it helps an employee know how to ask for help and who to contact. And second, it sends a message to employees that you as an employer care about them and what they need, which demonstrates that you are making efforts to be an inclusive workplace. If it's helpful, we have included an example of an accessibility statement in the Learner's Guide.
Thanks, Julie. I love the idea about how making training accessible can benefit all employees. I look forward to hearing some of those examples. So let's shift now to discussing some ideas for how to make communicating information with deaf and hard of hearing employees more accessible. I understand that each employee with hearing loss is unique, and what he or she may need to effectively communicate at work will also be unique. But Julie, what are some general best practices employers can consider?
Dennis, the first idea is simple. A good place to start to understand the best way to communicate is to ask the employee how he or she prefers to communicate. We don't want to assume that all employees who are deaf or hard of hearing know sign language or how to read lips. And an employee may have more than one way they prefer to communicate.
Now, Julie, what do you mean by that? When might an employee have more than one way they wish to communicate?
What I mean is an employee may need a sign language interpreter for information as important as training. But for those familiar daily tasks, an employee may be able to communicate by reading lips or communicating with gestures or by writing a quick note. So by asking the employee what he or she prefers, you'll learn the best way to communicate. And I think it's helpful to know that there will be times when you are communicating with an employee who is deaf or hard of hearing, and that employee may not understand what you're trying to say. It can be a natural tendency to want to talk louder, but this doesn't help. What can be helpful is to rephrase what was said instead of repeating it. For example, instead of repeating that you should use sanitizer if you aren't near soap and water, you could rephrase the statement to say, if you can't wash your hands, you can use hand sanitizer.
Okay, that makes sense. So you mentioned reading lips. For those deaf or hard of hearing employees who rely on lip reading, what do you recommend employers do now that many employees and customers are wearing face coverings?
Dennis, that's a great topic to address. First, whether you are wearing a face covering or not, it's important to make eye contact when you are communicating with a deaf or hard of hearing employee so he or she knows you are speaking to them. And when you are wearing face coverings in a workspace where deaf and hard of hearing employees work, we recommend wearing clear face masks. These allow the employee to see facial expressions and to read lips. We included some resources in the learner's guide on where you can buy clear face masks. And we also included a resource on how to make them because many vendors who sell clear face masks are out of stock. So if you can make one, that is a great option. Of course, you want to consider what kind of face covering you need to wear in your work environment to make sure what you choose is effective. For example, one of the resources we included is for a surgical mask, and that may be required in a medical setting, but may not be ideal for a retail setting.
Thanks, Julie. That's a great tip for sure. I also understand that language and using things like gestures can be helpful in communicating with deaf and hard of hearing employees. How so?
That is true, Dennis. Being thoughtful about the language we use and making sure to include some gestures when we communicate can really be helpful. Let's start with language. It's best to use common language and avoid language that is abstract or that includes things like jargon, highly technical terms, or more information than is needed. For example, instead of saying that your goal is to mitigate the spread of disease, which uses the technical term mitigate, you could say your goal is to try to keep the virus from spreading, which uses more common language. And it can be overwhelming to include extraneous information that isn't necessary. For example, rather than telling an employee about all of the things in the work environment that need to be cleaned, it may be more effective to tell the employee what items he or she is responsible for cleaning. By removing the extraneous information, it makes it clear what the employee is responsible for cleaning. Along with considering the language you use, you will want to sharpen your acting skills, even if you feel silly, because using things like gestures, props, demonstrations, and facial expressions really can help to convey a message. And employees who are deaf and hard of hearing genuinely appreciate when you make these efforts.
Julie, that's a very helpful lesson to learn that using visual methods can help to communicate what you're saying. Are there any other visual tips that we should consider?
There are some additional tips for communicating with visual methods that can be helpful. Sometimes training materials are delivered through video, which can be great. Videos can be played at various times, and employees may have access to review the information as needed. What's important is to make sure these videos include captions, so the information is conveyed in writing. One of the ways you can add captions to a video that is becoming more popular is through AI, which is artificial intelligence. This can be helpful, but because an actual person is not creating the captions, you may have some errors. So if you use AI, you just want to make sure to correct any mistakes before you publish the video. And because of that, professional captioning may be the best option at times. Regardless of the way you add captions, including captions in your videos can be one of those proactive measures that comes with a few benefits. First, if you create a video with captions from the start, you won't have to go back and add captions later when you receive a request for an accommodation. Also, employees who are not deaf or hard of hearing can benefit from captions as well to better absorb the information that's being shared. So this is another example of how making something accessible could benefit everyone. In addition to creating videos that are captioned, you may also want to consider creating videos in sign language. This can be a great way to communicate important information and information that is repeated often. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has created a series of short informational videos about COVID-19 in ASL, which is American Sign Language. This is a great resource for all of us to be aware of and to share with others, but it also serves as a great example if you want to create your own videos in sign language. You can find these videos on OOD's YouTube playlist, and we've included the link in the Learner's Guide. And Dennis, there's another best practice I want to mention. There are certainly going to be times when a sign language interpreter is needed. And there are options for this to be provided in person and remotely. When the interpreter is on site in the workplace, it's important to ask the deaf employee the best place for the interpreter to be positioned, and also where the employee prefers to be, so he or she is able to see the interpreter. I think this is a simple step to take, but sometimes in the hurry of getting training started, this can be overlooked. And for those times when having an interpreter on site is not an option, you can consider whether VRI, which is video remote interpreting, is appropriate. And we've included some resources for VRI in the Learner's Guide as well.
Wow, Julie, that's a lot of great and useful information. Before we go on, let's pause to see what questions we have.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Dennis. Currently, there are no questions in the Q&A box.
Okay, so let's turn our focus to some best practices for communicating with blind and low vision employees. Julie, what should employers know?
Dennis, let's start with the physical distancing component of social distancing. When employees return to work, they aren't returning to the same workplaces they left. Employers have implemented physical distancing practices to make sure employees are 6 feet apart from each other. And to support this, they're reconstructing spaces, using floor markers, and installing barriers like plexiglass. Because the workplace is different, when a blind or low vision employee is planning to return to work, it's important to ask the employee what he or she needs to orient to the new environment and to adhere to these guidelines. Oftentimes, when a blind or low vision employee begins a new job, he or she may need what is called orientation and mobility training to learn the new work environment. And then after a short period of time, the employee can navigate the space independently. That same approach could be beneficial in learning this new physical distancing environment. Another tip you can implement that is simple but may often be overlooked is to announce yourself when you enter an area where a blind employee is working. It's also helpful to say when you are leaving the space. Doing this informs the blind employee that the workspace is being shared, so the physical distancing guidelines can be followed.
Thanks, Julie. I like the idea of asking the employee what he or she needs to orient to the new space. That really is the person who knows best. And tapping into what we already know works, like providing orientation and mobility training, is a great idea to consider. Now, what about service animals? Are there any special considerations to think of?
Well, Dennis, it's always important to remind all of us that service animals are working and performing important tasks. We know it's not appropriate to pet service animals. One of those reasons is because it could distract the animal from the task that he or she is performing, and it can be a risk to undoing the animal's training. Also, during the pandemic, it's important that the service animal is free of distractions so he or she can learn the new work environment as well.
Yes, that's a good reminder. Now, what about training documents? I imagine many of these new procedures at work are being communicated in written materials and through handouts or posters that are being displayed in the workplace. What considerations should we think of for making documents accessible?
This is a fantastic topic to talk about because learning to make documents accessible is not as difficult as it may seem. And once we know some of the accessibility rules, we can create new documents that are accessible from the start. This can prevent having to recreate documents or make changes when a request comes in. And some of these accessibility changes may make documents easier for everyone to read. And as we know, when accessibility changes benefit everyone, we enhance that feeling of inclusion we are striving for in the workplace. So let's talk through some ideas to make documents accessible. First, you may need to produce documents in alternative formats, such as Braille, large print, or audio. Now, you may choose to wait to create some of these formats until you get a request, such as creating a document in Braille. But you may find it helpful to create documents in alternative formats in advance, such as large print. So I'd like to share a few best practices. First, to correctly make a document large print, you do need to use electronic editing. Unfortunately, using a copy machine to enlarge a document does not make it large print. You also want to consider font size. If you are making a customized document for a specific request, then the font size is based on what the employee needs. But if you are making a large print document for general use, it's suggested that you use a font size of 18 to 20 point. And you want to use a font such as Arial or Calibri, that is sans serif. A serif is an extending feature at the end of a stroke, and these can be difficult to read. I'd also like to talk about color and emphasis. It is a best practice to minimize the use of color, but there will be times you want to incorporate color into your training materials, so you'll just want to be mindful to use a high level of contrast. We also want to consider how we show emphasis in written materials. One common way we do this is with italics, but italics can be difficult to read. So a better way to show emphasis that is easier to read is to underline the text or use asterisks. And then once we've created an accessible document, we may want to print it. So we want to give some thought to the type of paper we are printing onto. It's best to use paper with a matte finish to avoid glare, because glare can make it difficult to read the document.
Thanks, Julie. Those are important tips to remember. Now, what about documents that are viewed electronically? Are there any particular helpful hints to keep in mind?
Dennis, there are some helpful tips specific to viewing documents in their electronic format. An important element to consider includes images. It's great to use images to convey messages. We just want to make sure they are accessible, and we can do that by describing images with alternative text, which is known as alt text. Including alt text allows the description of the image to be read by a screen reader. A screen reader is a software application that enables people who are blind or have low vision to read the text of a document through a speech synthesizer or a Braille display. And as you know, Dennis, we've incorporated some best practices into our PowerPoint presentation today. For example, we made sure to use the recommended minimum font size for PowerPoint of 24 point or larger. We checked our color contrast by using the free online contrast checker from WebAIM. This is a really easy tool to use. You just enter the font color of the written information and the background color of the document, and then the contrast checker gives you a score so you know whether you have passed for accessibility. Another effort we made is to not include too much content on one slide. If you have more content to share, you can either create another slide for that information, or what we've chosen to do is supplement the presentation with a learner's guide that includes that additional content. Dennis and I are also doing our best to try not to talk too fast today and to speak clearly. Not only for all of you to understand what we're saying, but also when you're working with AI for captioning, it can be kind of like a partnership. What I mean is, although the AI technology is improving greatly for live captioning, you can help improve the accuracy of that technology by talking with an unhurried pace and being intentional about speaking clearly. And most importantly, we included an accessibility statement in our invitation to attend today's event so that if anyone needed an accommodation, they knew how to request one. And because of that, we are also providing a separate live feed of this training with an ASL interpreter for those who requested it.
Well, those are great points, Julie. And by using the selection pane, we were able to make sure screen readers dictate our PowerPoint in the correct order. Also, the WebAIM contrast checker has been helpful as a way to make sure our presentations are accessible. We also use some other tools to check for accessibility in our documents. Julie, can you tell us about those?
Yes, absolutely. So we've already discussed the free online contrast checker from WebAIM. Also, Microsoft has a built-in check accessibility function in its programs such as Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. This function allows you to quickly identify accessibility errors in your document, and it offers ways to fix those errors. I prefer to leave it turned on, so I always know the status of the accessibility of a document I am working on, because I find it easier to make a document accessible as I'm creating it, rather than go back to check for accessibility after the document is complete. You can also check a document's accessibility to be read by a screen reader. If you have a screen reading software, you can use that one. But if you don't have a screen reading software, Microsoft Windows has one built in called Narrator, or NVDA also has a free screen reader you can use. And all of these resources are included in the learner's guide.
Thanks, Julie. Those tools to check documents have certainly been helpful for us. Thanks for sharing those ideas. Now, before we go on to the next topic, let's pause and see what questions we have.
Hi, Dennis. Hi, Julie. The first question we have is, for the deaf and hard of hearing, have you had any success in getting the audiologist to adjust the settings on the hearing aids or to add an additional setting for when communication partners are using a mask, as their speech will be muffled and softer?
That's a great question. I don't have any personal experience of knowing whether or not that has occurred or been successful, but it's certainly one idea to consider. Certainly in that situation, it's kind of novel for all of us that we're wearing face coverings, and so communicating and kind of troubleshooting those barriers is also new. And so my recommendation would be to ask the deaf employee what ideas he or she has that might make that communication improve. We talked briefly about how using gestures or writing quick notes can be helpful. So if making those changes to the hearing aid are not helpful, some additional tactics that we shared hopefully could be troubleshooted to see if they would work.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are some alternatives to AI captioning?
Some alternatives could be transcription, which is called the acronym of CART, and you can do CART on site or you can do CART remotely, and that's when you have a professional stenographer who is typing exactly what they hear, and then that text comes up on a separate screen. You can do live captionings with a person with some softwares. Those are the alternatives that I'm familiar with.
Okay, great. Next question. What's the difference between using the auto captioning included with the software versus our company contracting with an outside company to do the captioning in a presentation?
I imagine the software is going to be automatic, so computer generated AI, and if you're contracting with another company, it may be through a live professional captionist who may be using some software in conjunction with being able to correct mistakes on the fly. So that would be my guess. I would need to know who the external provider is to know what they're using to provide the captions, but that would be my guess, is that they may be using a combination of a real person and some kind of technology like AI.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you talk a little bit more about what orientation and mobility is for blind and low vision employees?
Yes, orientation and mobility training is a technique that is used when it's needed to help a blind employee or an employee with low vision learn their new work environment. So when you think about when you arrive at work, you have to approach the entrance, you have to navigate the path within to get to your workstation, understand where the restrooms are, where the break room is, where the lunchroom is, where the tools and equipment that you use are located. And so by providing this orientation and mobility training, you're helping the person to learn their new environment, which takes sometimes just a day or two, and then the person is able to independently navigate that environment. So it's just really engaging with the employee to understand what are the techniques that help you to learn a new environment and practicing. And then, like I said, within a couple of days, typically a person is independent in understanding the new environment.
Okay, thank you. One last question before we move on. This is in relation to your response of the captioning question. What's the benefit of one type of captioning over the other?
Well, as we mentioned with AI, although it's improving and it's wonderful to have it, it's not always going to be perfect. And so if you can supplement that either also with a real professional person who can make changes on the fly or who can just provide their own captioning, you may have a higher rate of accuracy. The benefit of AI is it's built into some of these software platforms like what we're using with Teams today, and so it's easy for us to activate it. We didn't have to call and schedule with somebody. It's part of what we already have from an economic standpoint, and so with everything, there's pluses and minuses, but for those accommodation requests that you get, you likely want to lean more towards providing a real live person to improve on that accuracy.
Okay, great. That's all the questions for right now.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thanks everyone for those questions. They were great. Now let's consider some best practices for communicating with employers with intellectual disabilities. Julie, what tips do you have?
Dennis, there are a variety of ideas we can consider to make sure communications with employees with intellectual disabilities are effective. It's always important to remember that each employee is unique and what he or she may need will also be unique. But there are some general considerations I'd like to discuss. We have all been dealing with many changes during the pandemic, and change can be difficult. Sometimes when there is something new to communicate in the work environment, it can be helpful to give the employee advance notice of the new topic, and this could help with adjusting to that change. When training is planned, it can be helpful to provide the employee with any training materials to review before the training event occurs. You may also want to consider allowing additional time for training and to reinforce training with daily guidance and feedback.
Now, Julie, don't we all have a preferred way of learning?
We do, Dennis, and I'm glad you bring this up. There are three main learning styles: visual, auditory, and tactile kinesthetic. Some of us are more dominant in one of these styles than the others, and some of us use more than one style to learn best. If I am more of a visual learner, it may be helpful for me to learn new information if we include written materials, or if we create agendas and flowcharts, or provide pictures during training. If I am more of an auditory learner, it may be helpful for trainings to be recorded so I can listen to them later, or include audio videos in the training to convey a message. Or it may be helpful for me to reinforce new information I've learned by having a group discussion. If I am more of a tactile kinesthetic learner, then I learn by doing things and having hands-on activities, such as seeing a demonstration and then practicing a task. So considering these styles when creating training materials may be beneficial to enhance the learning of all employees, including employees with intellectual disabilities.
Thanks, Julie. I love the recognition of the various learning styles. I think that could be very beneficial for employers in delivering training to all their employees. Are there any specific things to consider regarding the language we use?
Yes. Just as we discussed when we talked about accessible communications with deaf and hard of hearing employees, being aware of the language we use to convey a message is important for employees with intellectual disabilities too. It's best to use plain language that is literal and clear. For example, instead of saying high-touch surfaces, say things that people touch a lot. An employee who thinks literally may interpret high-touch surfaces as surfaces that are high off the ground, not items that are touched a lot. The Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities has posted on their website a document that includes information on COVID-19 using plain language and visual illustrations to communicate information. It's, of course, a great general resource for all of us, but it also serves as a great example if you want to create your own versions of training materials. The Ohio Department of Health also has an example of a document on their website that provides information on COVID-19 in plain language with illustrations, and it's another great general resource that benefits all of us. And it also serves as an example to create customized communications. The link to both of these examples are included in the learner's guide. What I'd like to point out about these documents is that certainly they may make communications accessible when this information is being shared with employees with disabilities. But these kinds of documents may also appeal to the visual learners who receive information best with illustrations. And also, some of the pictures are showing how to perform a task, such as hand washing, and that may appeal to those of us who learn from a tactile kinesthetic perspective. So creating documents in this way may benefit all of your employees, which again makes the culture more inclusive of everyone. Another tip when communicating information is to speak with an unhurried pace and pause to allow the time for the information to be absorbed. When you're giving instructions to an employee with an intellectual disability, it can be helpful to repeat the instructions the same way each time, instead of rephrasing what you're saying. And it's ideal to have those instructions given by the same person each time. Once you've provided instructions or training, you can check to make sure the information is understood by asking open-ended questions. And these are questions that can't be answered by just saying yes or no. Or you could ask the employee to demonstrate how to complete a task they received instruction on. Another method for making training communications accessible is to reinforce training with the employee in a one-on-one format. And you can do that by using a trainer, a mentor, or a job coach. When you're using a job coach, it's important to make sure the job coach is present when you're delivering any new information. And Dennis, you have experience working as a job coach. I imagine you can talk with us about how job coaching services may be impacted right now with employers limiting how many people are in the work environment. And I know you have some great ideas for us on how to provide job coaching services remotely.
Thanks, Julie. I do have some ideas on how we could look at providing job coaching remotely that certainly would be beneficial during the pandemic and also for those other times when it may not be ideal to have a job coach on site. But first, I think it's helpful to start with what job coaching is. I don't want to assume everyone is familiar with this service. Job coaching is a service that can be used as an accommodation for an employee with a disability to help facilitate the onboarding process and to enable the employee to learn their new work tasks. Job coaching reinforces the training provided by the employer. Job coaching is provided by a job coach, and the service is often provided on site with the job coach working one-on-one with the employee. How a job coach facilitates the employee learning new tasks is based on an understanding of the individual components of the job and a good understanding of what the employee's needs are, which are always determined on a case-by-case basis. Some examples of what a job coach may work on with an employee includes instruction on work tasks, how to manage his or her time most effectively, and proper communications at work. The job coach also evaluates how the employee is doing at certain intervals along the way. Ultimately, the goal of job coaching is to enable the employee to perform the job effectively and independently. Because working independently is the goal, the job coach begins planning for fading of job coaching almost as soon as the service begins. The job coach supports both the employee and the employer and frequently communicates with the employer regarding the success of the service. In addition, the job coach should be a resource for identifying workplace supports, reasonable accommodations, as well as offering communication and training help to supervisors.
Dennis, that's a very helpful description of job coaching. And I could see how it's effective to have a job coach on site. Certainly, I know there are concerns with having extra people in the workplace right now, but you mentioned there are other times when it may not be ideal to have a job coach on site. And I'm curious to know when those times are.
Well, Julie, traditionally, job coaching is provided on site, and even during the pandemic, there may be times when this is necessary. When that is the case, there are just some things you may want to consider. The first thing you want to think about is whether having a job coach on site is essential to the success of the employee. This may vary from case to case. A discussion may be helpful between the employee, supervisor, and the job coach on the best way to support the worker while minimizing risk. When a job coach is on site, they should be made aware of the guidelines that have been implemented for COVID-19, including personal protective equipment and social distancing. Also, the job coach may be on site to provide specific supports. However, the job coach may not be on site as often and may want to assist the employee with both using self-management strategies and learning how to use the services and applications of job coaching that can be performed remotely. Now, certainly job coaching is provided on site more often than not, but prior to the pandemic, there definitely were times that on-site job coaching was not ideal, and that's really for a couple of reasons. There are times when an employee simply does not want a job coach on site working with them. This may be because they don't want the attention they feel it may draw to them, or they may have a concern that coworkers will think differently of them. And of course, we want to respect the employee's feelings about that. Secondly, there are times for security reasons or confidentiality concerns that employers are unable to accommodate having a job coach on site. So this option for providing remote services is not new, it's just not as well known. But definitely now, during the pandemic, it's worth considering how these remote services could provide creative ways to provide job coaching.
So it sounds like there are three main times when it may make sense to consider providing job coaching remotely. I am very interested to learn how job coaching can be done remotely.
So Julie, I think many of us have learned how to use technology in new ways over the past few months, and that's been pretty amazing. Now, job coaching is no different. The goal is to provide the same service, but maybe in a different way. It just takes some creativity to use some of what we already have or are familiar with. Let me share some examples. Job coaching is sometimes helpful to enable an employee to remember steps in a work process. This might be done by identifying ways to break down those tasks or remind an employee to complete a task at a certain time. With remote services, a job coach could consider one of the many applications that are available on smart devices to provide the same tactics. For example, there are apps that allow an employee to program a list of things to do using pictures or words or audio clips for short instructions. There are also apps that have reminder features that can be programmed to alert an employee that it's time to take a break or time to stop one task and begin another. We could also consider using a video camera and a microphone to allow an employee to demonstrate performing a task so the job coach can provide feedback. And through the numerous options we have for making voice calls, video calls, as well as sending text messages, a job coach and an employee can easily communicate on the fly to troubleshoot a task. This is helpful if an employee has a question, or so an employee can ask the job coach about any unexpected situations that may arise during the workday. And so there really are some great ways these remote services can be provided through the apps and technology we have available. Sometimes it just takes some creative thinking on how we can provide accommodations.
Right, so let's talk about how job coaching can be a form of reasonable accommodation. Of course, the decision of whether or not job coaching is an effective solution is always determined on a case-by-case basis, and that includes the employee's desire to work with a job coach and the employer's ability to accommodate this service, whether it's on-site or remote. Using a job coach, whether it's on-site or remote, may require an employer to modify the way training is delivered. And modifying training is a form of reasonable accommodation. One of the ways training can be modified is to allow more time for training, which we mentioned earlier. A second way training can be modified is through providing additional assistance for training, such as providing a job coach. Providing job coaching remotely may require an employer to modify a workplace policy. And modifying a policy is another form of reasonable accommodation. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Many employers do not permit employees to use their smart device while they're working, but many of these remote job coaching services require the use of a smart device. So an employer may need to modify a policy to allow the employee to use their smart device strictly for remote job coaching services. Now, certainly the terms of this permission should be discussed and documented during the interactive process, and that way both the employee and the employer are aware of the specific guidelines for using the smart device for remote job coaching. And then once the decision to use job coaching as a form of reasonable accommodation has been made, there are some considerations that can be helpful to think about for both the type of equipment that may be required and to create an environment that is conducive for remote job coaching to be successful. Dennis, what should employers know?
Great question, Julie. So many people are likely familiar with the technology that can be used for remote job coaching services. These include things like smart devices, video cameras, microphones, headphones, internet access, and downloaded applications. The key to being successful is understanding how to apply the right technology for the service being delivered. And that's likely what the job coach will help to determine. There are some things to consider about the work environment that depend on what service is being used. For example, if an employee is having a video call to talk through or demonstrate a work task with the job coach, it is best to offer a quiet and private space for this call to occur. Also, for any video or pictures that are being used for the delivery of services, employers will want to establish agreements for the privacy of all employees, the protection of any proprietary employer information, and for any other security concerns.
I think that's a great point, Dennis, that what we need to provide effective remote job coaching services includes items and technologies that we may already have or are somewhat familiar with. That always makes implementing something new feel a little more doable. And it's great to mention that we do want to have a plan for how to handle things like confidentiality and privacy.
Yes, Julie, it's important to keep these things in mind. Now, let's pause one last time to answer any questions that may have come up before we wrap up today's presentation.
Hi, Julie. Hi, Dennis. We have several questions. The first one is, would it not be more inclusive to use people first language? I keep hearing blind employee. Should it not be an employee with blindness or low vision?
Stephanie, that's a great question. And thinking about language is very important. And the thought on that has evolved with time. And there are certain disability groups that prefer people first language. And there are other disability groups that prefer identity first language. There are some disability groups that feel they want to be identified as blind employees, as deaf employees. And so we try to respect what language has evolved to be and the preference that we believe that these different disability groups have. And you know, one great practice is to interchange it. And so you could say employees that are blind and kind of intermix it with also saying blind employees. And then you appeal to everybody's preference. I went to a conference last summer that was interesting. They had a panel where they had a gentleman from the name is escaping me, an older generation, and then they had a millennial who is part of what they call the ADA generation. And they were talking about the difference and how, yes, you're correct. It used to be that we always led with people first language, and then it's evolved with the new generation to prefer identity first language. And so thank you for that question. I think my recommendation is that you intermix the two terms. That way we appeal to all preferences.
Right, and the only thing I would add to that is if you're working directly one-on-one with somebody, to ask them what they prefer. So because in that situation, if you're directly working with somebody, they're going to have the best answer for themselves.
Great addition, Dennis. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next question. What happens if the job coach is on site and gets injured on the premises? Who pays for that?
Great question. I've had this question hundreds of times. Normally, the job coach is an employee of a provider, and they would be covered under their own liability, workman's comp for their employer. And I've had employers in the past actually ask me for a letter for liability when I was a provider, when I was a job coach and worked with job coaches. So that's something that an employee can always ask ahead of time. So if while working with the job coach, can you provide liability insurance for your job coaches, just so we know we're covered?
All right, thanks, Dennis. Next question. For safety reasons, our company can't modify our policy to allow cell phones on the floor. So how could we accommodate remote job coaching?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of situations where it just isn't possible for safety reasons or sometimes for security reasons to have cell phones. I've been in distribution centers where they just don't allow pictures to be taken, and we want to always respect that. The important thing to do is to modify the whatever remote job coaching to meet the needs of the business and the individual who needs services. So sometimes I've worked with individuals in the past where we meet right after the shift, sometimes in the parking lot right after the shift, and we go over the day and we talk about what went right, what went wrong, and come up with strategies for how we're going to handle those situations the next day. The key to this, I think, is just to be really creative. A good job coach is going to do whatever they need to do to support that individual in their position in a way that also supports the needs of the employer.
All right, thanks for that. Next question. Is it the employer's responsibility to provide the technology if remote job coaching is the accommodation?
Usually not. So, of course, employers do provide reasonable accommodations, but normally, the first thing I would say is most technology that's used in remote job coaching is technology that everybody has anyway. It's just you trying to find a way to use it in a different way. So if there was a specific application that was used for job coaching, probably the job coaching service would be providing that. That would be something they would already be familiar with. And OOD, of course, would help with anything. If there was something specific that the team got together and decided that this was really necessary for this individual to be successful, we would work with people with that and work with the individual and the employer. But I've never seen an employer actually pay for technology specifically for remote job coaching. Most of the time, it's an application on a cell phone.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is job coaching offered by OOD to any employer, and does the employee already need to be an OOD consumer?
Great question. Yes, so OOD specifically offers services to individuals with disabilities to help them be successful at work. So, but if there is an employee that has a disability and that needs services, we can quickly move to help that employee. So I don't want to give you the impression that if you have somebody who needs help, not to call us, because for sure call us. We'll make that happen. If somebody has a disability, we call it a job. Say we can always come in later, but we do need to have that individual, that employee come in and become part of our to get our services.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you find job coaches that have the needed technology skills for effective remote services?
Great question. So normally your the employee's counselor at OOD is going to help that employee find the right job coach that will have these services, the technology that they need to provide remote job coaching. And sometimes that's shopping around to a couple of different vendors to find the right, every vendor has things that they may specialize in. So like any other thing, just sort of interviewing different providers to make sure you're getting one that can provide the services you need is important. But the counselor at OOD can help with that greatly.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How can individuals benefit from remote job coaching who are not equipped with technology? Would phone calls work?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would say 90% of remote job coaching is done with a smart device like a cell phone or something similar. So most of the technology that we use for remote job coaching is things you probably already have in your pocket right now. Now there may be technology, of course, that can help an individual be successful at work that are in addition to that kind of technology. But if an individual needs something specific to be successful at work, OOD will help with that. Will help find out, and that's why we have Julie, that will help that individual find what technology they need and help to provide it.
Okay, thank you. Next question. You talked earlier about making it easy for employees to ask for help. Can you give some examples about how to do this with an employee who has an intellectual disability?
We recommend that you have an accessibility statement whenever you have training materials, whenever you announce events, whenever there's any changes. And I guess the only, we included an example of a statement in the learner's guide, and the only suggestion I would make is just to make sure you're using literal, clear, plain language. So maybe not, it doesn't necessarily have to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and go into a bunch of technical terms. Just make it simple and easy and announce what the event is. Maybe describe the environment so somebody knows what the event includes, so they know if they need an accommodation. And then just use clear, plain language to promote that.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Next question. Are there any special considerations for an employee with a service animal at work?
Specific to the COVID-19 environment, or can you say that again, Stephanie? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Are there any special considerations for an employee with a service animal at work?
Well, in general, there are some best practices with accommodating service animals, and that includes understanding that the animal has to be well behaved. The employee is responsible for proper hygiene and taking the animal to proper relief areas that are designated, so giving some thought to that. It's great to do some disability awareness training to make sure fellow coworkers understand what we try to emphasize today, that as much as you may want to pet a service animal, myself included, I have 2 black Labrador retrievers at home and I love all dogs. It's important that we know not to pet service animals because they are working and that can distract them. There can be policies that you alter to make it possible to have service animals on site, and giving consideration if other coworkers have allergies. There's some best practices on how to keep the distance and keep space between people so you can accommodate both. And so it's really unique to each work environment and what the needs are of all the employees, and there's certainly some best practices around that we could provide to you if that would be helpful. There's some great resources out there for that.
Okay, thank you for that. At this time, there are no more questions.
Well, thank you all for those wonderful questions. We are nearing the end of our time together, so I'd like to touch on a few closing thoughts. We've talked quite a bit about how to make communications in the workplace accessible for all employees, including employees with disabilities. And although this is always important, we wanted to address this now when employers are communicating important information about their changing environments and their new safety procedures during the pandemic. We hope the information that we talked about today helps to give you a starting point for evaluating your communications in the workplace. But even more so, we hope you're inspired by the realization that not only are some of these tips we talked about simple and inexpensive to implement, but that making this effort may make your communications materials more accessible for all employees, which makes everyone feel included at work. And we do know that despite proactive measures to increase the accessibility of workplace communications, there will be times when an employee will need an accommodation. And because of that, it's a good practice to make it easy for employees to ask for help. And one way we can do this is by placing that accessibility statement front and center in all of your communications materials. And when you're talking with an employee that has requested an accommodation, the best way to identify what he or she needs is to ask. The employee likely knows best what will work most effectively. We certainly hope the many ideas we shared today on how to communicate and also on the creative ways that job coaching services can be provided remotely are helpful for you as you move forward through the COVID-19 pandemic and into your new work environments. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today, and thank you, Dennis. It has been great to have the chance to co-present with you.
Thank you, Julie. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just as a reminder, please remember to submit the training evaluation to give us feedback and to receive HRCI credit. We will be posting a recording of today's presentation and we'll forward that link to you at a later time. And I'd also like to announce that our next virtual training is disability etiquette, and it is scheduled for July 16th. So please be on the lookout for that announcement. We'd love to have you join us again for that training. And with that, this concludes today's presentation. Thank you.